Hello, my name is Melissa Mahle, and I have the honor of moderating today's discussion on learning to live with COVID-19, the geopolitical implications of the pandemic. This policy discussion is made possible through a partnership between Dentons and Texas A&M University's Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. The Scowcroft Institute fosters and disseminates policy-oriented research on international affairs by supporting faculty and student research, hosting international speakers, and major scholarly conferences. And the Bush School offers graduate programs for our next generation leaders in public service and is located in College Park, Texas. Dentons, where I am a senior analyst, is the world's largest law firm with 189 locations serving 77 countries around the world. We are polycentric, meaning there's no single headquarters, there's no dominant national culture, and we're not your normal law firm. And that's exemplified that they hire people like me. I am not a lawyer. I spent my career with the CIA clandestine services. Denton's Global Security Officer, Carl Hopkins, who unfortunately is not going to be here with us today, he leads the Intelligence and Security Services group at Dentons, and which is really quite a unique group. We help our clients understand the geopolitics and socioeconomic risks that are crucial to successfully completing deals, resolving disputes, and solving just business challenges. And for the better part of this last year, the number one business challenge has been the coronavirus pandemic. So I am the editor of Denton's Flashpoint report, which focuses on how the pandemic has accelerated specific pre-existing trends, particularly sharpening disputes, inequity, and introducing disruptive technologies. And I'm proud to say that the Scowcroft Institute is a routine contributor to our report. So when I look at the playing field, I see certain kinds of trends. And one of those is that nations and businesses have had to change their priorities to navigate through this public health crisis. And doing nothing was not an option. We did a very hard pivot immediately to a remote workforce where possible, which presented a host of cyber access and security challenges. Our supply chains were disrupted, requiring a rewiring of how we source goods and services. Corporate and sovereign debt has just blossomed as we move from business continuity to operational resiliency. So surviving is a good first step, but it's not sufficient. And the real challenge is identifying organizational and operational change needed to thrive in the post-pandemic world. And to this point, we need to understand what this new world will look like, what are the key trends, and what are driving them, and who will be establishing the new norms and standards. So today we have an excellent panel assembled to provide insight on these questions and others. And before we get started, however, a bit of housekeeping. I will introduce our speakers, and each will provide opening remarks for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will open it up for a discussion. We have a number of questions from participants that were submitted in advance, and I will endeavor to ask as many of those as possible. And then we will also take questions from the Zoom chat function. So without any further more to do, I will introduce our speakers in the order that they will speak. So first off, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Sir Dominic Asquith. So after a number of years as a researcher, teacher, journalist, and traveler in the Middle East, Dominic joined the British Secret Service in 1983. He served in the Americas, South Asia, and returned frequently to the Middle East. He was ambassador successively in Iraq, Egypt, and Libya between 2006 and 2012. And then after retiring in 2013, he obviously could not get enough of government service. He was called back to serve as the High Commissioner in India from 2016 to 2020. Dominic is currently a partner at the Macro Advisory Partners, which provides independent, long-term strategic counsel to decision makers in business and government. He had previously served as a senior advisor at Dentons. So Dominic is really well suited to offer us a global perspective He has broad experience both in terms of geography, but also in the pressing national security challenges of the day. So with that, let's welcome Dominic.
Thank you, Melissa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Really good to join you, and a real privilege to be on a panel with Andrew and Will on what is an important subject. And I think we were looking initially at the sort of geopolitical context. And I would say, if I had to sum it up in the COVID context, there'll be more fragmentation and the cohesion will be pretty uneven. Now, just as a sort of preface, I think that sense of relief around many world capitals at the outcome of the election, US elections, masked two uncertainties. The first uncertainty was about the long-term reliability of American foreign policy commitments. But the second was the degree to which industry and trade policy have entered into the sort of national security ambit. And I think that's an important overarching one. Now, why do I say more fragmentation? Well, the global landscape has realigned. That predated COVID, but COVID accelerated it. The actors, to varying degrees, are going to be less heedful of aligning with a US position. And indeed, I think their relationship with the US will be conditioned much more by regional balance of power considerations rather than ideology. It's not an us or them. But no mistake, the US is still going to be material, but it will be more contested than before. So the world's going to look much more like an archipelago. The pandemic has not prompted deglobalization. It's rather accelerated a rather different type of globalization. There'll be winners and losers. And when you come to companies, the winners are going to be those who, as you say, adapt. They move between the markets, how they manage their supply chains, their IP, their tech, their capital, their data, their legal structure, even their nationality. And fundamental to understanding the various scenarios is, of course, going to be the role of China, which we'll go into much more detail. But Chinese leaders are going to continue, I guess, to bet that the gravitational pull of their growing economy is going to prove irresistible to key companies and to key countries. And China will recouple with other countries. We just had the signing of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, as the latest example. But at the same time, countries are going to seek not to get caught in a sort of US-China friction. But dealing with the challenge posed by China is going to be less about preventing China's rise and much more about shaping the environment in which China is working. We're going to reshape or shape Chinese leadership calculus on, for example, tech competition or workable international rules of the world. We're going to need to build a much greater sense of common ground between US, European, Asian partners on regulation, on taxation. And on Europe, looking at Europe, those major European powers, they're not going to expect an identical set of strategies with the US towards China, but I think it's reasonable for them to envisage complementary and coordinated strategies. Indeed, there may even be the expectation of convergence, climate being the most obvious example, even if climate tech may actually prove rather more frictional. But another driver, other than Chinese role, is going to be what I call middle powers. You start from a premise that the next decade is going to see a continuing reduction of relative US influence and authority, but at least a plateauing, possibly even a rise in China's influence. At the same time, you need to remember that in foreign policy terms, a president of China or of Russia is a far lonelier person than the president of the United States. President-elect Biden's test is going to be his ability to build, to mobilize, and to adapt to the intersecting coalitions of like-minded powers, and to tackle and use that to tackle the very different set of dimensions of the challenge that Chinese presents. But in the context of a US public, which seems to be much different from what it views the US role to be than it had, say, 15 years ago. The challenge, I suspect, of a first year of a Biden presidency is going to be demonstrating to a skeptical, perhaps, American citizenship, the value of international cooperation in succeeding on what will be the two top priorities, dealing with the pandemic and the economic recovery. Some of those middle powers are going to be collaborative with the US, albeit they will want to navigate between China and the US. They'll share the view on equitable access to global goods, to free trade, protection of democratic liberal principles, free movement of goods and people, access to technology and energy, dealing with climate and so on. But there are going to be other middle powers who will be disruptors or challengers who will exploit US retrenchment for their own interests, whether regional or wider. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have disruptors. Geopolitics, trade, just like tech, occasionally needs disruptors to sharpen our approach to modern challenges. And en passant, I am struck how many in power seem bent on outdoing some of their famous predecessors. Xi with Mao, Putin with Stalin, possibly Modi with Nehru. But when you come to Russia, for example, I think the options will follow in a fairly narrow band between competitive, pretty sharply competitive from Russia, and adversarial. But I would say don't give up on Russia, because at some point, Russian and Chinese interests are going to collide. The collaboration with those collaborators, as it were, the like-minded, is not going to be predictable, hence my uneven cohesion. The metrics that they will follow, their economic power, their political, military, soft power, and so on, won't necessarily accurately predict their appetite or the confidence of governments, or indeed the expectation of their own populations. Nor will it predict on what subjects they will collaborate, or indeed the geopolitics of their region. In Southeast Asia and the Middle East provide a whole host of examples. And I just would reinforce that importance of regional groups. You think 5 years from now, and trade and investment rules may largely be set by two multinational arrangements, the CPTPP and the RCEP, neither of which will include the US or indeed India, and one of which will not include China. So trading rules won't necessarily be set by the US or China, and indeed they may require, in certain circumstances, the US and China to adapt to the rules set by others. Now, if you're a multinational company, well, how might I, if I was the CEO, want to start positioning myself now for an evolution of global dynamics over the next decade? And I think a key question I would have if I was a multinational is, if China could be a winner in a decoupled world, would it change the life of my company? And there'd be another set of questions which flow from what one might call the end of the Washington Consensus, the end of 3 or 4 decades of a pretty laissez-faire approach to free movement of goods, of capital, of people, which has shifted to an industrial policy, to intervention, to economic planning of an activist state, which is back in, as it were, government is back there, seeking to guide the private sector to perform better. And that has a number of consequences. Public contracts are going to be in greater number, especially in areas deemed critical for national security. Political connections will be much more important. But here's the really big one, which is, yeah, supply chains are going to shorten, but the production centers will proliferate. And it will become increasingly advantageous for brands and manufacturers to make things in particular places and more places, to circumvent the tariffs and the other barriers, to benefit from some of the incentives. and to follow that shift from just in time to just in case. And you see around the world how companies, understandably now, are moving to China for China or China plus strategies. You see it similarly replicated in Europe. So that's the sort of broader context in which I reckon we'll be working over the next decade. Enough for me, Melissa.
Well, thank you, Dominic. That was very rich. And so you paint a picture of a very complex international environment of fragmentation and of really negotiation again and again on issues that are looking for that coalition of willing. And I like very much this idea of the middle power as a, you said with uneven cohesion or perhaps disruptors. So it brings to question of how does China fit into that world as you kind of laid it out. So what I'd like to do is turn to Will and to Dr. Norris and to have him provide a little bit of insight from that optic, that view of how the Chinese see the world. But let me introduce him first for those of you who don't know him. Dr. William Norris is currently an associate professor of Chinese foreign and security policy at the Bush School of Government and Public Service, where he teaches graduate level classes in Chinese domestic politics, East Asian security, and Chinese foreign policy. Dr. Norris has been an associate with the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, where he looked at the potential for a conventional U.S.-China conflict to escalate to the nuclear realm. He also is a postdoctoral research associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Public and International Affairs and a fellow at the Princeton, Harvard, China, and the World Program, a joint program created by the two universities to foster the study of China's foreign policy. So Professor Norris has written a very interesting book called The Chinese Economic Statecraft, Commercial Actors, Grand Strategy, and State Control. The timing of this book is really right on there, because as I look at our world, and we've watched the U.S. and China compete economically, but now we have seen that move to the realm of great power competition. So Will, why don't you talk to us about how China sees the post-pandemic world?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Melissa, and Dominic. Thank you for the great insights to get us started here today. So I think I'll talk a little bit about how China views its position and sort of where it stands coming out of COVID. And before I do that, I wanted to kind of build on something that Dominic talked about, this growing sense of regionalization, or what I'll call sort of this emergent regionalization. The notion of regional identity becoming increasingly salient in international politics. And the reason I think this is an interesting and a good insight to begin the conversation today, because it's certainly the way that China has for a long time viewed its own position in global affairs, is through that regional lens. And it has for a long time explicitly sought to avoid global presence and global responsibility in favor of a larger regional context and a regional domain of influence or presence. And what you're seeing today is kind of a merging of those two as China begins to get more comfortable stepping into that more global role. I also liked Dominic's observation of uneven cohesion. And he had talked about how these ideas and values and interests will be an important sort of salient vector along which you might see the regional powers or the middle powers making decisions. And one observation I kind of want to throw in there for consideration is it seems to me that these values and interests and ideas in some ways lay dormant during most of the conduct of day-to-day international affairs until they become challenged, or until they certainly run up against a potential threat or a challenge to those values or those ideas. And under those circumstances, I think they can be quite powerful in determining where nations end up in terms of with whom do they find common cause and how do they align themselves, not maybe formally through treaties, but in practice. And I think the reason, it's just kind of an interesting mechanism I'd put out there maybe to think about as a panel to kind of explore intellectually is whether or not these values actually potentially are most powerful when challenged and under conditions under which they're challenged. And here I'll put out one example is Russia and China maybe didn't find a lot of common cause until they discovered US hegemony really potentially threatened or challenged some of their values and interests. And they view this, particularly leading up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when the United States essentially, opinion in the UN was quite against the US taking unilateral actions. And the United States essentially said, well, in this situation, we have to. It's in our best interest. It's in our national interests. We think there's real just cause here, and we're going to go forward anyway. And I think that moment for countries like China and Russia was a real wake-up call to sort of say, oh goodness, we have some shared interests in opposing what they viewed as unbridled American hegemony in international affairs. And I think, so that's one example. Another one, obviously, is Japan's foreign policy, which Japan's grand strategy is keenly hinged on shared values and interests. And Japan views its grand strategy for the next decade or so to fundamentally rest on what it views as commonly held values that it shares in common with its large treaty partner, the United States, and other potential emerging partners, again, in practice in the region, Australia, Japan, and Japan sees those interests and values as really the core for motivating their view of grand strategy. And again, I would suggest that these may have been there all along, but maybe they were somewhat dormant. The Quad is an idea that's been around for decades now, but it never really got much life until the last 2 or 3 years, when there was an acute sense that these values or interests may be beginning to face more of a headwind and challenge going forward in the region. So again, just this idea potentially that these values and interests may work in an international theory kind of sense, most powerfully when challenged or when confronted with a potential threat to those values and interests. Okay. Enough of the IR theory stuff. Getting to China. So I think China, where does it see itself as it emerges out of COVID? I think there's 3 things that I'd suggest to kind of start our conversation here. The first one, which was quite clear in the way China projected its handling of the initial first wave of the COVID crisis, which is to say the big dominant talking points that you heard coming out of China is China's system of government, of economics, of China's model was quite effective at dealing with the kind of a challenge like the pandemic. When there is this sort of threat to society, the Communist Party was very deliberate in noting that it was the party that was most able to effectively step in and defend and protect the Chinese society, and by extension, the world, through its model of government and public health. And so there's the first theme was this notion that there's something about the Chinese model that makes it simply more effective, and it's on display in how China handled the pandemic. It's kind of the first logic. I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm saying this is kind of how it's being projected in China. The second, which is an extension of this, is the Chinese economy, for the most part, is seen domestically as largely having already begun to emerge in its post-COVID form, that it's already beginning to bounce back. And China's economy, China's grasp on the pandemic is already under control, and then very quickly, by extension, China would point to the rise in U.S. cases recently, and the fact that the U.S. model doesn't seem to be doing a very good job of handling the pandemic, does it? Is kind of the way that China would be portraying that narrative. And so the second point, so the first one, China's model is more effective at handling the pandemic. The second point is China's economy is probably, or at least China hopes that it's going to recover perhaps more quickly than a lot of other nations' economies are going to be able to recover coming out of COVID. And I think that's going to be seen to give China certain advantages of being able to bounce back. This was certainly the narrative you saw after the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, when China said, well, it didn't really hit China as hard and we were able to recover. We kind of protected ourselves and we were able to, the dip that China experienced was not as deep, nor did it last as long as it did elsewhere around the world. Again, a testament to the resiliency in that instance of the Chinese banking system, which is resilient, this line of thinking goes, largely because the government retains such an important guiding hand in the evolution and the behavior of the Chinese banking financial system. So I think you'll see a second sort of line of argument that says the economy is going to bounce back. It's going to come back ahead of other nations. The third one, I think, and this kind of gets into this notion of potentially the multilateral organizations and sort of the larger regional dynamics. But the third one, I think, is China, even going into the pandemics, had made a shift. It no longer thought of itself as a rising power and was now beginning to get more comfortable with thinking of itself as a great power. And I think that's even more true if you limit the domain to the regional level, that China feels like at the regional level, it's almost without a doubt a great power, and it's potentially a great power on the global stage as well. And so China thinks about, well, now what? Now that we've arrived, what is it that motivates China's strategy in this post-pandemic world? And I think a lot of what China seeks as a function of its newly confirmed great powerdom is deference to Chinese strategic preferences. China views that as a great power, one of the things that great powers get in international affairs is the ability to have others defer to their preferences in a way that non-great powers don't enjoy that luxury. And non-great powers have to sort of live with the world as they find it. They don't really have an opportunity to shape the world as actively. But great powers, they're in a different group. Great powers in China, this as right and appropriate, and that now that China's achieved this status in international affairs of great powerhood, that it also gets to enjoy the benefits of deference for its strategic preferences. So I'll leave it at there, Melissa, and looking forward to an interesting conversation.
Well, thank you very much. That's very interesting. I like very much this idea that you have presented. This is the China moment. It has emerged. It's no longer emerging. It is now a great power, and it expects to be treated as such. And of course, in the context of your earlier remarks about how countries are going to be banding together under like-minded shared values, how that's going to shake out the world, because not everybody is going to have an easy place within this contested space. And I would put the developing world in that category. So, that nicely tees up the remarks, I think, by Andrew Natsios. And let me briefly introduce Andrew. Andrew is an executive professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service since 2012, and he is the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. He currently serves as the chair of the Program Advisory Committee for Harvest Plus, which is part of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, and as a fellow of the Michael E. DeBakey Institute for Comparative Cardiovascular Science and Biomedical Devices at Texas A&M College's Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. Now, Andrew's had a distinguished career serving his country. He spent 23 years as a veteran in the U.S. Army Reserves. He's a former elected official from Massachusetts, and he spent a number of years deeply involved in humanitarian support, including as the USAID administrator. So Andrew's experience gives him really a unique insight into the nexus of the foreign policy, development, and the special challenges of fragile states. So with no more ado, Andrew, please. You are on mute.
Thank you. I'd like to make 3 points. The first of which is that the international system that was set up after World War II has shown a lot of strain, particularly in the last decade. The World Bank financial model is not working anymore. They've had to lay off thousands of staff. And they're weaker than they used to be, even though the bank's research on development issues is widely used and respected. We can tell the erosion of these institutions through the Global Fund for HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria, to look at the gap between what countries pledged when President Bush and Kofi Annan set this up in 2002 or 2003. I was AID administrator when this all happened. I was involved in that effort. And early on, when countries made a pledge, they paid the pledge. You could see a convergence. Beginning about 8-10 years ago, you can see a growing division between what people have pledged and what they're actually paying. And that is an indication of an erosion of the system that this is happening. The Secretary General of the UN said publicly, former Prime Minister of Portugal, he's the former High Commissioner for Refugees, that the UN system does not work without American leadership. And I believe that's true. I believe that's true. So what is it that we can expect from the UN system, or maybe to change the UN system in the next few years? There are many proposals, but I want to focus on health because we're dealing with this crisis with COVID-19. And I think this is only the beginning. I've told people, they don't like to hear this, this is a dry run. This is not the big event. The big event will be much higher death rates with much more catastrophic consequences, similar to 1918, where during the great influenza of that year, 5% of the world's population died at the upper end of the estimates within 6 months. That did not happen now. Certainly a lot of people have gotten ill and all, but we're not even remotely approaching that right now. And that will happen eventually. And that's why this should be a wake-up call to all of us that the systems that we have in place are not working. Now, what is not working? WHO has been a relatively weak institution since it was started in the 1940s. And I think there are people now bashing the UN and then people supporting the UN uncritically, and that's not helpful. The criticism of the UN is they won't allow Taiwan in, or Dr. Tedros, because he did get Chinese support and he was too easy on them early on. That's not the big problem with WHO. It's competence in emergencies that's the problem. And if you talk privately to emergency managers, and that's my background early 30 years ago, no one looks to WHO to intervene in an emergency. They look to UNICEF to do the health stuff in an emergency. Now, how do we know that? Well, the Global Fund was not set up within WHO. Neither was the Global Fund, Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. In fact, there's a whole bunch of international health institutions that were set up outside WHO because no donor actually believes WHO is capable of running these things. They do very well at setting standards, of coordinating, but in terms of emergencies, they don't do it very well. Why is that? And it's something that's not on the table at all for discussion, and this annoys me a lot. When WHO was created in the 1940s, PAHO, Panamanian Health Organization, had already been created in the late 1930s, before the UN was created. PAHO is the WHO of the Western Hemisphere. And they refused to join WHO unless they were given regional autonomy. Well, when that happened, all the other regions of the world also asked for autonomy. So the assistant director generals, who in any other UN agency would report to the director general, they don't. They report to the council that's 30 countries, which means, if you report to 30 countries, you don't report to anyone. You basically do whatever you want to. And the regional powers orchestrate who gets elected, because it's an election, which is another stupid system. You don't elect senior administrators below the director general himself or herself. You have that person appoint the people so that they will be responsive. So the regions have veto power over any emergency response. That is current policy. There have been efforts by WHO to change that, and the member states will not do that, will not allow it. Why? Because they want their local interests protected. It took 5 months for WHO to declare Ebola as a huge crisis. And it was completely out of control once they did that. I remember the WHO office in Egypt when I made public the records or the evidence on atrocities, mass atrocities and war crimes in Darfur. The regional office said that I made it all up because the Arab states that are allied with Sudan and Omar al-Bashir at the time didn't want to embarrass a member Arab state. And so they just denied it was going on. No UN agency would normally have done that. Why did they do that? Because the regions control these regional offices instead of the Director General. So Dr. Tedros has to be very careful what he says so he doesn't contradict what these regional offices say. That needs to be fixed, and it needs to be fixed now, or we're going to have this repeat itself again. The second thing with respect to the international system and disease is WHO has an early warning system. It's called GOAR. It was started years ago. The last 3 major epidemics or pandemics, including this one, they didn't use it for political reasons. It was not used, even though it's a good system. So I've argued in an article I wrote for Foreign Affairs, our journal, I think it was in July, that we need a pandemic early warning system. Right now, we USAID, my old agency, in 1985, long before I was there, started the famine early warning system, the FuseNet it's called. It's been around for, let's see, 35 years. It's highly effective. It's predicted almost every famine that's taken place with 1 or 2 exceptions. It uses satellite photography of ground cover in addition to ground truthing, where they send teams out to see what's going on in the markets and food prices. It's been highly effective, and Alex de Waal wrote a wonderful book, the British famine scholar, called Mass Starvation, in which he said there's been a substantial decline in the last 150 years in the number of famine deaths. And he said part of the reason, not the entire reason, is because the international humanitarian response system is actually working very well. Well, why don't we take that idea and apply it to disease? Now, I'm interested in the latest comments the Chinese made today that the pandemic started in Europe. It did not start in Europe. It started in China, but it didn't start in December. There's some considerable evidence from remote sensing that it started in late August. Now, I don't actually think they knew it started at Beijing. I think the local officials, because the incentive structure is so distorted in an autocratic system, they had huge incentives not to report what was going on. Why is that? And this has been in scholarly articles. This is not a secret, that if your infection rate for a whole series of diseases go up beyond a certain point, you are penalized in your salary and your promotions as a local administrator. So there's a huge incentive not to report bad news. And that's true in any dictatorship. The reason it doesn't happen in democracies is you can't keep a secret like that, because we have the free press, we have assembly, we have civil society organizations, we have scholars who are independent of the government, we have the news media, we have think tanks, and they report whether the government wants the information or not. They will be told what is going on because of the pluralistic nature of our societies. That is not true in China. And so I don't know whether they knew it or not, but there's a Harvard study that shows in late August of last year that there was a substantial increase in the number of people visiting health clinics and hospitals in the greater Wuhan area. They can tell that from satellite photographs. The second thing they noted is they asked, you can do commercially, you can do this now. You can go onto Twitter and buy information about different geocodes in the world and ask what are people talking about? Well, beginning in late August, early September of last year, people started reporting in the greater Wuhan area the symptoms that we now associate with COVID-19. Are you getting sick? And here's what the symptoms I have. Well, why did that happen? And again, we need an early warning system based on remote sensing, because autocratic governments are not going to report early enough to stop what's going on. And so my argument has been, we need multiple early warning systems just in case one fails. And so I argued we should have one in the European Union. We should have maybe do it with Great Britain. DFID, I don't know what it's called now, but DFID was one of the most respected aid agencies in the world, at least it used to be, until they started making budget cuts and doing bad things to it, in my view at least. But AID could set up, maybe with Canada and Australia and Great Britain, an early warning system. And then we have one in WHO, maybe one in the Gates Foundation, but we need multiple systems so if one fails, the others won't. And we need to reform WHO, I mentioned earlier. During the Cold War, the one area of cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States was in health. We made a deal in the 1960s. It was USAID, the Center for Disease Control, and the Soviet state. We used WHO as a coordinator, but it was actually run by the Soviet Union and the United States. was an effort to wipe out smallpox, one of the worst diseases in human history. In the last century, it's estimated 300 million people died of smallpox in the 20th century. 300 million, that's a low estimate. There are estimates as high as 1 billion people died of it. There has been no instance of smallpox since 1977. Why? Because a coordinated campaign in the middle of the Cold War wiped it out, because we know how to wipe it out. We had immunizations that could do that. And I argued in an article I wrote for PRISM, a military journal on strategy. It was an article on foreign aid during periods of great power rivalry. It came out just as COVID-19 started, that the one area we should be able to work together with the Chinese, the Russians on, is in health, but that apparently is not going to work out so well. It's become highly politicized now, and that may be very difficult to do. The second thing I'd like to mention, not as much depth, is that there is a debt crisis in the developing world. A lot of the new debt is from China. We don't know the actual extent of it because these are not transparent transactions between the Chinese government and their parastatals and these countries in the developing world, not just in Africa, but in Latin America and in Asia as well. There's a revolt against the Belt and Road Initiative in a number of countries, in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia. A lot of questions are being raised about the fine print. A friend of mine who's a career diplomat in a large African country, I will not mention it, told me, I said, didn't you read the fine print when you signed these agreements? He said, we didn't, Professor Natsios, and we are now, and we cannot believe we signed these, we signed these debt agreements. Because what they say is if you don't make your payments, you lose your port, you lose your oil wells or your gas fields. And Ecuador, for example, made a deal with China to build a dam, which never got built, but they borrowed the money. And now China has taken control of their oil fields, and all that revenue is going to China, and it's really enraged the Ecuadorians. So I think there's a review of this going on. Now, China has announced that because of this debt crisis, countries are unable to pay their bills to China on this debt, that they will consider forgiving it temporarily or different arrangements. It's got to be more than simply postponing it. It's got to be forgiving it, because that's what Tony Blair and George Bush actually crusaded an effort among the donors to forgive the debt. And we appropriated money in our Congress, as did the British government through Parliament, to put money aside to pay off the debts of countries that were paying 80% of their government revenues to pay off loans, international sovereign debt loans. So there's a debt crisis that needs to be dealt with. The third thing, you've mentioned it, but I would just focus it in on COVID-19. 85% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients used in most countries in the world, it's certainly in Europe, a lot of Africa, and in the United States, come from China, and much of that is from the greater Wuhan area. What is an active pharmaceutical agreement? It's the ingredient in prescribed drugs that's the thing that makes the difference in terms of treatment. And we wrote an article through the an academic news service called The Conversation, the Scowcroft Institute, in March, just as this was beginning. And we said, we got a little problem here. 85% of our drugs are dependent on greater Wuhan. Those factories are all shut down now. FDA announced in late March, early April, that 22 different drugs were on the edge of experiencing severe failure in terms of the supply chains, because of, not because the Chinese were penalizing us, but because the factories were shut down because of the pandemic. They have contacted, Marxist institutions, Marxist countries, and autocratic countries sometimes focus whole industries in one region. That's very dangerous. And so I think now we are going to see health in the same way we see national defense. We would not have all our weapons system produced in China or in Russia, for that matter. We would never do that. Why are we having our drugs, which determine whether our people survive or not, produced in another country that has hostile interest to us? The health minister in India actually announced, until all the Indian people are treated, we are not exporting any more drugs to any other countries, including the United States. He wasn't being mean. He was saying what any leader would say is, we're going to, help our people first. So I think you're going to see the pharmaceutical industry, and if they don't do it, Congress will do it for them, and the administration. It doesn't make any difference who the president is. they're going to pull back all these supply chains for pharmaceuticals, for medical disposals, and I would argue also for medical devices back into the United States, and other countries are considering doing the same thing. And that's at a minimum, So anyway, those are three areas that I wanted to comment on. Thank you.
So there was a lot in that. Thank you very much, Andrew. I was particularly struck by your comment that the current pandemic is a dry run. And so it provides us with a moment here of looking at our international system, looking at our alliance structure, and looking at the need to reform international institutions. At the same time, we're seeing this highly disruptive international environment. So I guess my question to the panel is, are there areas that there will be a meeting of the minds that leadership, international leadership, will be able to work together? We've already seen the politicization of the pandemic. Is there going to be other areas? I like the early warning system, but maybe that's going to be a step too far. So I would be interested in what maybe China would think about areas of cooperation. Or Dominic, what does India and Russia think? Where would they fall into their priorities, where they see global cooperation is a better option?
Sure. I'll go ahead and just very quickly get started. I think where you've seen China taking a more active role in coordinating internationally and multilateral organizations has typically been in those organizations or those spaces in the international system where China feels like there's very clear failures or there's a general disillusionment with the existing architecture. That's where China seems to have shown a willingness to propose new multilateral organizational constructs, largely often focused around China when they do those kinds of things, or proposing reforms to existing constructs. The general theme of a lot of that activity usually is that first and foremost, it's designed to sort of serve China's own narrow interests. I think China's covered some criticism for that. I don't think you can point to very many examples where China has put forward a multilateral proposal or an organization that's explicitly going to harm China's interests and yet potentially be beneficial to the overall system. Generally, what China prefers to do is to find ways that enhancing China's interests also happen to benefit the rest of the region or the overall system. But I think that's kind of a theme in terms of where China has gotten involved. The second space is in a lot of the emerging technologies or a lot of the emerging areas that are relatively underdeveloped or less mature in terms of standards or creating those mechanisms for managing those evolving areas that structurally speaking call out for coordination. This is, I think, exemplified in spaces like standard setting and those kinds of things. That's another space that China's shown an active interest in seeking to shape those standards. Again, I would suggest largely because it's conducive to the direction that China wants to shape those kinds of directions and those standards of those kinds of institutions. Over.
Melissa, can I pitch in? I mean, I think it's a fascinating subject. We could spend the next hour talking about it because there are areas. So let's split it up into 2 or 3 bits. There are certainly areas that can be collaboration. Climate is the most obvious one, and as I mentioned, when you get into the technology of climate change or green technology, you may have something quite interesting happening, which is in political terms, a fairly uncomfortable set of competitions going on between China, US, Europe, whoever. But actually for the world, it might be quite beneficial. That competition actually may produce the breakthroughs in terms of price and capability that will be extremely advantageous. But the overall possibility of greater cohesion on climate, I think, is not just now an ideal, an unrealistic hope. It is potentially quite real, and we will have the test of that at the end of next year, this time next year, at the next conference of the parties, which the UK is hosting in November next year. But that's an obvious one. You can then go into different areas. India, for example, has been pushing an important one, which is resilience to natural disasters. How can you put together a global community which deals with that? And he gets into some of Will's points, which I think are really important, which are, when you're going to do this collaboration, there are two bits. There is the regulatory, there is creating the regulatory framework that is agreed. And as a parenthesis on this one, there's a whole set of areas, space, data, cyber, for example, where the regulatory framework, the architecture, does not exist. So somebody has to come together. I mean, globally, we have to come together and create that architecture, and it will be a test of whether it can be done consensually or whether it will be done competitively. But to go back to the sort of the rather specific area that Indians were pushing, which is resilience to natural disaster, you have to create the regulations, and then you have to look at, and they're a bit shyer about this, the enforcement mechanisms. How do you entrench, having created the regulations, how do you entrench observance? And it's a mixture of incentives and penalties. And it's incentive and penalties that have to creep into the commercial world. How do you get companies to build stuff which is resilient, which costs more? It's the same argument in some of the climate, the green agenda, which costs more, but overall, A, is good for humanity because fewer people die. B, is probably cheaper because if you look at the insurance payouts on the back of natural disasters, they're massive. And if you had more resilient architecture, you wouldn't have to, it wouldn't cost so much. So there is certainly capability. It does have those two areas. There are other areas where I'm much less optimistic, and sadly, pharma is one of them. And I'm less optimistic because I am assuming that the monetary advantage of the big pharma companies, in the sense that they have put so much money into the research, makes it almost impossible for them to share the product. Now, I find it fascinating the way that vaccine politics on COVID may break out into an extremely unpleasant and difficult competition and friction between India, China, Russia, Europe, US, all those places where the vaccines are being made. Or, one would hope a degree of coordination and collaboration to ensure that they will be equitably distributed. And that will only happen if there is a real recognition, as some are already saying, that we're not through COVID unless we've dealt with it globally. You can deal with it in the US, or you can deal with it in Germany, or you can deal with it in India. But if the person coming into your country is carrying it, that's no good for you.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this, the competition or politicization over vaccines, because I have a couple questions from our participants on that topic. And so we seem to have kind of two different trends that are ongoing. And now the question is, what is going to be the most compelling? To Andrew's point that this is a dry run, that we can expect future global health emergencies and need to have a system, a set of systems that is going to address these, and therefore we have to build a cooperative environment. But can we do that in a world that we see a lot of, fracturization, both globally and regionally? We have a recession, and so we're not going to have, the pharma companies, to your point, Dominic, are not going to be willing to give away their intellectual property. And yet, at the same time, we do have the COVID facility that is being hosted by the UN as a potential model in order to bring a vaccine globally to protect global citizens and our global economy. Andrew, you didn't talk about that, and I would be interested in hearing your views on whether that is that possibly the beginning of a new cooperative effort, a new model?
Well, I tend to be more of a realist on these things and take a darker view of human nature. I think the notion of international cooperation, in the post World War II period was very unusual in world history. It was not normal. The countries did not behave the way they normally do. One thing that's happening that's very depressing with respect to vaccines right now is Russian bots. And this is not a rumor, okay? There's a study done at George Washington University by scholars, a whole bunch of scholars. They tracked the anti-vaccine messaging, and they found out a large portion, they tracked it on Twitter. A large portion of it's coming from Russian bots. And it's exactly half. Half of the bots are saying if you get vaccinated, you'll get autism, or your children will be autistic, or they'll be Down syndrome, or they'll get sick and die. And the other half say vaccines are a good thing. And I asked some Russia scholars, why are they doing that? The same bots are sending out contradictory messages. They are trying to undermine world confidence in science. They're creating what the scholars said was epistemological chaos in the West, particularly in the democracy. Problem is it's spreading to Africa. The percentage of people willing to be immunized in the United States, the last data I saw, is down to 50%. So you can provide a vaccine, but you can't go around the country and put a gun to people's head and say you are going to be vaccinated. We have to have, we don't have a strategy for countering this outrageous propaganda we're getting out of Russia. I have to say that's not something the Chinese would ever do. I don't believe. The reality is the Chinese are acting in their own interest. Russians are not even acting in their own interest. They're just creating chaos, and it's not helpful. The Soviet Union would have been embarrassed by what Putin is doing now. It's unfortunate, particularly in an area like health. So I am a little bit pessimistic about where all of this is going. Maybe things will, when this is over, we'll look back and say we need to fix these systems, and someone will confront Russia with this. But right now, it doesn't look hopeful to me.
Well, that requires global leadership, and that requires strong leaders that are going to act on the basis of a set of values that prioritize the public good. We have, maybe as to close out our conversation here, we have an incoming administration, the Biden administration. They're going to have the administration is going to have a lot of challenges on their plate from day one. They've already made some comments of what are going to be their priorities, but since we're in the United States, and I know, Dominic, you may not want to give advice to the American leadership, but I hope you will. What would you advise the incoming administration that their top three priorities should be, or just make it their top priority, and the best way to go about it? So let's start. We'll go backwards. We'll start with Andrew.
Well, the first thing I want to add to this, you talked about more intellectual cooperation, and people are assuming that because now Biden is going to be president instead of Trump, that everything's going to change. Every single one of the international health regulations, which were negotiated 10, 15 years ago, and now, I mean, they were negotiated over a period of time by the countries of the world through WHO. Every one of those rules was violated by every country, major country, and middle income country in this pandemic. And one of the people who negotiated them is a friend of mine in Washington at Georgetown. And she said, Andrew, I'm so depressed. She said, I actually went through and looked through all the regulations. Everybody's violating all the things we agreed to. So when the crisis comes, a lot of these international agreements unravel. And it's not a function of who the US president is. It's a function of parochialism, panic, and what apparently has happened in more than one country, even countries that are on the left, not just on the right. So we have to review this and just determine why it happened and what could be done about it. I'm not sure there's an easy answer for that. So, I mean, I just want to add that in.
So in other words, let's try to find our way back to a rules-based world. Okay.
I don't see, given that we have these rules in place and so many countries violated them, the question is, do these international rules work? That's the question.
Are they compatible with our day and age? Will?
So I'm not going to presume to be able to tell them what their priorities ought to be. I think that the team already has a pretty good sense of where they want to focus. And I don't, so I think that their number one priority is going to be COVID. They feel like they need to get this thing under control. I think shortly after that, or at the same time as that, it's the economy. The American economy has had a huge setback as a result of COVID. And I think they know that, they understand that, and they're going to get that righted. I think on the international front, I think there's a really strong emphasis on partners and allies, and the point that I think Dominic led us off with about the reassurance and the outreach and the just that diplomacy, that diplomatic side of U.S. presence in the world and in international affairs, I think is probably on the international front, probably the third priority. But I would venture to say that that's going to take a backseat to those first two priorities. And all of that, I think, is going to be done in a way that also infuses in it the Biden team's sense that this is a different moment because of the energy that they got from the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, that there's a real social justice dimension to their preferences as well as they go about doing numbers 1 and 2, COVID and the economy. So I think that's going to color the way that they want to go and approach some of these things. And that includes the green tech and the green revolution stuff as well in there. So I think that those things are going to end up sort of shading and sort of coloring and styling the way they go about COVID and the economy, possibly the way they go about managing international partners and allies. But that'd be my sense of their priorities. Over.
Very good. Dominic, wrap us up.
No, Will's got it absolutely spot on. And the 4 priorities that the Biden team have put out on their website are pandemic and economy at the top. They're the same that any other government around the world hit by the pandemic will put at the top 2. So yeah, there will be an inward looking element. And what I said, I think holds true, which is the degree to which there is bandwidth and willingness from, I assume, a skeptical US citizenship about the role of the US in international politics, the degree to which there's bandwidth to branch out into international policy will be, I am sure, dependent upon the ability of the administration to demonstrate to the American public that international engagement by the US is beneficial to those 2 top priorities. There will be a third, which is the third of the 4 priorities they put on their website, which is climate. No question about that. And that does present real opportunities over the course of next year in the build-up, as I say, to COP26, the Conference of the Parties, to be ambitious and moreover to be able to develop the sort of international alliances and partnership Will was talking about with other like-minded, which, funnily enough, might include China. She has put out his ambition about where China should be by 2060. It is a rare occasion for a Chinese leader to do that, and I think that's significant. So those China, climate would be surely the most fertile ground for developing the sort of arrangements that could exist. I keep coming back in my mind to Tocqueville. I can't not, there is that bit where, he says the great privilege of the Americans consist in their being able to repair the faults that they may commit. And I've got to believe that that's going to be so.
Well, I certainly hope so. This has been a great discussion, and I want to thank the panelists for their thoughtful comments. And I'm left thinking about this from a business perspective, that as we emerge from this pandemic, and it's not going to be tomorrow or the next day, we face rough seas. Those seas are going to be highly unpredictable for an extended period of time. We may see some isolated cooperation, but we will see a lot more contest, that our allies or traditional system of alliances may no longer be there. We're going to have to work hard to build coalitions of the willing, and it's going to take concerted leadership from the top in kind of in a stressful environment. So maybe that's not a very uplifting idea, but I will leave you with this. The Congo declared itself Ebola-free. So, major outbreaks can be controlled. We just have to get there from here. So thank you very much for your participation, your comments, and thank you to our audience for joining us. Bye-bye.